Good morning, good morning, good morning, and good evening. See, oh God, I'm going to do that every day. I have my alarm for this, and it goes off every single time when I start. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Welcome to the bittersweet end of TMF week. But we have day 5 here for you, a full day ready to go. We got some fun stuff going on. You guys can hear me good? Amazing. Yeah, I know. I'm sad it's the last day too, hater, but I know that there's some people that might be grateful that we're finally here at the end of TMF week. It's been absolutely crazy, but in the best way possible. And shout out to the entire team actually in the background, like Kim Bruce and the whole marketing team that are, putting this whole thing together for you guys. It's been absolutely amazing. And I know everybody has been having a great time. So without further ado, I will get into the housekeeping. You guys know the drill at this point. You're all experts. We're going to have all the sessions recorded and they're going to be available at the end of today. They're finally here. It'll be the end of today. You guys can go back and you can watch all the sessions you missed. There's going to be some fun ones. I definitely think that Harry Potter session is going to be very, very replayed. If you didn't see that, go back and watch it. That is it. But all the sessions are great. You're going to have a great time. So all the attendees, you guys are going to get a certificate of attendance at the end of today or soon. I don't know actually entirely when that's going out. But you're going to have it, and it's going to be awesome. We're going to have a 15-minute QA session at the end of this session as per usual, and then we're going to have our lounge networking break afterward for 15 minutes between each session, and I will make sure to let you guys know when that's happening. So the session timeline, as you experts know, but if you're just joining us right now on day 5, it's going to be about 30 minutes. Then we're going to have a 15-minute QA. Then I'm going to introduce the next session, and then we'll have our networking break. And so without further ado, Matthew and James, I will introduce you guys, give you the floor. Thank you so much for doing our 9 a.m. session, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. We're going to talk today about a risk-based approach to digital preservation and archiving of the eTMF. Hopefully this is something that you've already started thinking about a little. If you have been in the TMF world, you've hopefully archived a study or two. To do some brief introductions, Matthew, if you want to go first.
Oh, yep. Hi guys, I'm Matthew from Archivum. We provide a sort of data archiving digital preservation solution. So I'm going to cover that a little bit later in this talk, especially how digital preservation can help TMFs remain accessible, readable, and usable.
And I'm Jim Markley. I'm with Just-in-Time GCP. I've been in the industry for over 10 years now, starting at a clinical research site and then a CRO, and then here at Just-in-Time. A lot of experience with a wide variety of systems and the kind of common pitfalls that people fall into. So let's start by setting some baseline here, right? So hopefully you've seen an image like this before, or at least the information that it represents, right? And this is about what actually constitutes clinical trial data. And that is more than just what the reference model describes, right? The reference model and the artifacts and sub-artifacts within them describe the minimum list of essential documents as described by ICHE 6. It talks about the other trial records that may permit the evaluation, but there's also a whole different slew of records that live outside of that that may be called upon should an inspection come, or that may live in other systems that support your trial and support the integrity of your data. So while ensuring that everything in your reference model is, considered and has a place to live, don't forget that there is other records, right? The TMF typically ends up being pretty study specific, and you tend to have a lot of organizational level records that support these things. So for example, your vendor selection or qualification process, depending on how your company handles those processes, you may be doing that at a larger than study specific level, and you're qualifying a vendor as a supplier and not necessarily a study provider. Those records may not live inside your eTMF, but they're still relevant content that could be called upon in an inspection. And where does all of that live? Well, we use the collective term TMF, and frequently people refer to that TMF as your eTMF, but those aren't necessarily the same thing, right? The large majority of documentation will be in your eTMF. That could be sponsor held, that could be with your CRO, that could be with someone else. But most organizations also have a bunch of documentation in other systems, whether that is an internal system, your QMS system, your LMS system, you have a safety database, a CTMS. It's not just one platform that we need to consider when we're thinking about where our clinical trial data is stored. And likewise, the archival of that data is still relevant for each study, not just the documents themselves. Data kind of goes through a bit of a life cycle, regardless of if you're thinking of it as a data point captured in EDC or a document captured in your eTMF. It goes through a similar set of stages of being created, stored, used, published, archived, and destroyed. Quick little example here is a financial disclosure form, right? So for an individual site, the PI comes in, they sign their financial disclosure form, you now have created a data point or a document. From there, you're going to store it in the eTMF, hopefully. You'll use it throughout the life of the study to determine if there's any need for disclosure. Those FDFs need to be provided to the appropriate regulatory authority as needed. Once the study is completed, you're going to go ahead and you're going to archive that for however long you need to hold it. And then eventually you'll get to the point where you can destroy it. And because in the TMF world, we love documentation, when you destroy a record, that often then means that you're creating another record as evidence that you destroyed something, right? So it's a bit of a cycle as much as I'm showing it as a linear timeline here. But it's important that when you get to those last two stages, archiving and destroy, that you're not just then trying to figure out what it is you're going to do with all your data, right? You've gone through the race of the study and you hit the end and then you go, okay, what am I supposed to do with it now? There should be a plan from the beginning that represents what it is that you're going to do with that data. I think I saw we had a question pop up in Q&A. If a company SOP states that vendor selection files are internal and not in scope of TMF in case they are claimed during an inspection, could this constitute a finding? Honestly, it's going to depend a bit on the inspector and which regulatory authority you're referring to. An inspector has every right to ask for how it is that you determined which vendors that you used. In fact, I believe it's one of the early pieces of the BIMO, especially if you've had issues throughout your study, right? So if you had vendor issues, it's kind of a common line of thinking to then go, well, how did you determine this was the right vendor for you? So those could potentially be a finding if they found out that the process wasn't being followed and that you ended up selecting vendors that were not appropriate or that could not perform as intended. Okay. So when you want to go and determine a risk-based approach for managing this, right? There's a lot of documents, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of work that's involved in the TMF. Everyone who's in the TMF knows that it's a lot of effort, right? It's not easy. It doesn't just magically happen. So 100% of anything is overwhelming. But what we can do, and ICH E6R3 has emphasized for us, is identifying a quality by design approach where we can identify critical processes and data and have a plan for it. So what this ends up looking like, right, is answering some of those questions listed on the screen to know for each stage of the data lifecycle, what is it that you're going to do? Where is it going to live? What does oversight look like? How are you planning on managing all of it so that you're ensuring quality throughout the entire life of the study and the life of that data by design? The best way to do this is, in my opinion, a risk assessment. And with that, you can kind of determine what is critical and what can be leveraged to develop your risk-based approach. have an example for us to just quickly walk through here. Oh, did I skip a slide? Hold on. Oh, there we go. I'll go back. An example is if your protocol has a primary endpoint that requires assessments to be done by trained raters, then we would identify that the evidence of their training is critical, right? We need to know that the integrity of the data that's being included as part of the data set is being performed or is being collected by individuals who are appropriately trained. Well, that can then translate to your TMF plan, where you'll include that type of assessment and checking for that training as one of your checks during your oversight. And your TMF index can also clearly delineate then what it is that is going to be produced as evidence of that and where it's going to live and who's going to file it. So you're able to kind of keep the full story of this key data point in your thoughts throughout the life of the study. Now, I clearly jumped the slide, but if I go back, this is just talking about all of the pieces that really go into this TMF strategy, right? We just talked about an example with a risk assessment, a TMF plan, and a TMF index. Hopefully you've seen these things before, but if not, once again, just at a high level, the risk assessment is identifying what those critical data and documents are. Your TMF plan is outlining what it is that you're doing and defining your risk-based approach. And your TMF index is outlining where all that content is being held. On top of that, we would recommend that you have a set of business rules at a company level that describe the quality that is expected for documents that can be done across all of your programs, right? It helps reduce some of that risk of, well, one study did it this way and one study did it that way. You have your clear set of rules. And then you're going to put into place some periodic oversight reviews that are outlined within your TMF plan, where you're checking throughout the life of the study to ensure that everything is complete. Once again, we want to do this throughout the life of the study because when you get to the point of archival, it's too late, right? It's too late to be trying to find what's missing. There's too many documents already in the TMF. Trying to then go back to closed sites or a CRO that you've already received the TMF from is going to be really difficult to get that documentation back. And then right before the end of the study, right before archival, you should do a quick final oversight check to ensure that everything is ready to go. And if I skip ahead again, right, an oversight review is once again a cyclical process. This is not something that's one and done. It can be done in a variety of ways that have been described even during this week, right? You could do it as a periodic event every 3 months, every 6 months, whatever that may be. You could also do it based on specific milestones or events, right? You had a protocol amendment. This is a significant event. We want to make sure that we have all the content associated with it. But it's done in a cyclical manner. The issues that are being identified are going to be discussed with the content owners. They're going to be resolved. You're going to monitor it until the next set of reviews. So identifying when you're ready for that next step, when you're ready to archive, there's a whole kind of set of questions that you need to go through and kind of ask yourself, right? For all of those stages of the data lifecycle, identifying that there's no documents or data points being left behind. So are there still documents that you're expecting to be created or collected? If no, you can kind of move to the next stage. Is everything stored and where it's supposed to be? Are we still waiting on some of those documents to be uploaded? Making sure that everything has been stored, and then you can move to use. Are there any additional changes that we need to make? Are there quality issues that are open? Are there workflows that haven't been completed? And then you move to the next stage. Has all data been finalized and shared with the relevant parties, right? We want to make sure that before we're restricting access, before we're putting it into an archive state, you've done everything you need to do with the data. And then once you go into archive, and you have that cross-functional alignment of everyone agreeing that in all of these stages for the content that they own, all these boxes have been checked, we still need to think about then, are you prepared to provide an inspector access to those locations? If it's with a vendor, how long are they going to hold it? When is it going to come back to us? Are there audit trails? Will they be preserved? All of those questions for the archive location still need to be answered, hopefully have already been answered at the beginning of the study, but needless to say, we still run into some issues at the end. So once you have your risk-based strategy in play, that will help you monitor all of these stages throughout the life of the study and help you get to the point where when you're ready for archival, you're not just now asking these questions for the first time. I think this is where I pass it over to Matthew to talk about archiving.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jim. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to cover how long-term digital preservation can help ensure that a TMF remains accessible, readable, and usable. And that's over the whole retention period. For example, maybe you're a sponsor and your CRO has handed you a TMF and you need to archive it and do it in a way that's inspection ready. And you're thinking, well, how am I going to do that for 25 years? And as Jim said, it's not just a TMF, there's study data too, and all the supporting documents and records that might need to be kept, for example, from your QMS or LMS. But before starting, I mean, this is my first TMF week, and I have to say it's been great. So I just want to say many thanks to the Montreal guys for organizing such a brilliant event. Right, just advance, oops. I don't know how to drive this thing. So Jim's covered this already, but just as a reminder, when data is archived, all the usual GXP regulations and guidelines still apply. So things like the Alcoa data integrity principles apply throughout the life cycle, including archiving. That could be 25 years or longer. The one thing that the regulations and guidelines don't tell you is how to maintain data integrity for the very long term. They tell you to follow the Alcoa principles, but not how to do that in practice. And that's where digital preservation comes in, and a bit more on that later. The regulations and guidelines also say you should take a quality and risk-based approach, and there's been loads of discussion about that earlier this week. That also applies to archiving data, and as Jim mentioned, that's more apparent than ever in the new guidelines, for example, ICH E6R3. So we've really got four things, I think, that we need to piece together when retaining a TMF for the long term under the regulations. There's a need to take a proportionate and risk-based approach. There's a need to maintain data integrity for the full life cycle, which could be 25 years. There's the question of how to do that in practice, which, as I'll show, means long-term digital preservation. And there's still the need to use qualified suppliers, validated systems that are fit for purpose, and maintaining oversight. My main focus is going to be digital preservation as part of a risk-based approach. If you're not familiar, digital preservation is the management of digital content over time to ensure ongoing access. So digital preservation's matured over the last 30 years. It's really quite a well-developed discipline. Covers almost every area that you need to worry about for long-term data retention, including TMF and the GCP. Digital preservation is very much an active process. It's not like archiving paper in boxes and forgetting about it. You can't apply this sort of paper thinking to digital archives. And being an active process means digital preservation needs people with the right skills and experience. It needs resources and infrastructure. It needs appropriate policies and procedures, and it needs sustainable investment. The good news is that there's lots of good practice on how to do all those things in the real world. And a lot of that comes neatly packaged in what's called digital preservation maturity models. And as I'll show, we can use these as part of a risk-based approach to archiving and preserving TMF data and records. And I've given you three examples here. There's the NDSA levels of preservation, the Digital Preservation Coalition's Rapid Assessment Model, and Core Trust Seal. They're all freely available online, and they contain a wealth of practical advice. And I'll show you some examples from DPC RAM in a minute. Before I do, I want to distinguish a little between data archiving and digital preservation. especially given the way that archiving, the term sort of commonly used. So I think data archiving is typically treated as doing the digital equivalent of putting paper in boxes in some sort of secure facility. So archive data, for example, when you lock it in a TMF system, it isn't touched, it isn't changed, it stays there kind of as is. That's not digital preservation. Digital preservation is a much more active management of records, data, and metadata to ensure that it can all be discovered, accessed, and used in a readable and usable way whenever it's needed. And that's important when trying to achieve long-term data integrity and inspection readiness over sort of multi-decade timescales. Another way to look at that is to consider the Alcoa data integrity requirements, for example, for 25 years. So thinking about a TMF, will your documents and data still be legible after 25 years? Will they still be readable and viewable in tomorrow's software, especially dynamic data? Will those records be enduring? So how might data become corrupted or lost? Will there be evidence to prove that the records are trustworthy and they're still accurate, complete, and correct? Are there ways in which records could be altered or deliberately changed, or even maybe accidental changes? Will the records always be available? Will you still be able to find that data and understand what it is in 25 years' time, especially as the archive grows and grows and grows? We've heard several times this week about TMF metrics for timeliness, completeness, and quality. So after investing all that effort into those, when the study's live, the last thing you want is for all that good work to be undone when you're archiving the study for the next 25 years. So thinking about those risks and challenges in the context of the different types of data you need to retain, there's the TMF, and ICH E6R3 defines in detail essential records, and we have the TMF reference model too. But there's the other stuff that Jim's already talked about, so study data, supporting records. The point is that that data is not all the same, so you need to consider the retention period, criticality, and risks for each type of data that you're archiving. And then you can assess and manage how to take appropriate action. Likewise, I think it's important to consider risks in terms of the systems that are holding that data and their ability to support long-term retention and preservation. So locking a study in a TMF might seem like a good solution to start with, but kind of over time, live systems go end of life and new systems will be needed to replace them. And that can result in multiple migrations, and those aren't without their challenges. And I think there's another session later on today that's going to explore some of that. And over time, you can end up with more and more of these systems to worry about. And sometimes you might even end up keeping systems purely because they contain archive data, even if that's not their original purpose. And all of that multiplies risks. So moving data to a dedicated and consolidated archive is a good idea, helps reduce those risks. Consolidating data for all aspects of a study, not just the TMF, into a single archive, that's an opportunity too to check that you've got everything and it's all complete and correct and consistent. Of course, consolidating an archive might be a great way to get lots of data under one roof, but you still need digital preservation to ensure long-term data integrity. So now we get into the details of digital preservation, and I'm going to pick the Digital Preservation Coalition's Rapid Assessment Model, which is DPC-RAM for short, as an example. So the DPC, they're an international organization with several hundred members worldwide that specialize in digital preservation of a huge range of digital content types. So these sort of organizations, they've been there, they've done that, they've got the t-shirt, and they've shared their knowledge and good practice on how to keep data usable over time. And in DPC-RAM, there's a set of service capabilities that describe that good practice on how data should be stored, how content can be preserved, how metadata can be managed, how data can be accessed, and more. And all that aligns really nicely with the objectives of Alcoa. So in DPC-RAM, if we look at some of those areas, there's a lot of really useful and practical detail on good practice. So each area in DPC RAM has got a maturity level from 0 to 4. So 0 is being the lowest and 4 is the highest. And that means you can match the level of preservation needed to the criticality of your data and the risks, which means taking a proportionate approach. So here, I'm showing DPC RAM's bit stream preservation on the left, which in effect means safe storage of data. And under the Alcoa principles, that means ensuring data is enduring and always available. So good practice is to keep multiple copies of the data in different geographic locations, use checksums to monitor and confirm there's been no data loss. And because you have multiple copies, if something does happen to one of them, you can still recover using one of the other known good copies. And then on top of that, you worry about things like storage systems and storage migrations and vendor lock-in and disaster recovery, and put all of that as part of your risk assessment and data management plan. Let me show you another example. This is DPC RAM's good practice on content preservation. So under the Alcoa principles, this means ensuring data remains legible and complete. So in this case, it's about understanding things like the format of your data and then using preservation strategies such as file format migrations, software virtualization or emulation. And this is about ensuring you can always read and use that data in the future. So it's about opening and using files for decades to come and in the face of technical obsolescence of today's sort of fast-moving world of IT. And again, as with bit preservation, DPC RAM aligns directly to the Alcoa regulatory requirements for GXP data. One final example from DPC RAM, this time metadata management. So here, good practice is to do things like create a register of all your digital records and data. And metadata, you should be following standards, and you should use those to describe your data, including what it is, what format it's in, how it's organized, and how it's been preserved. And that all helps document and describe what's in the archive, how to find it again in the future, and how to understand what it is and how to use it. And that can be done in a risk-based way. So, for example, once you know what format your data is in, then you can assess and monitor the risks of using that format. So you ask yourself, is the data in a proprietary format, or does it follow an open specification or standard? Is that format widely adopted in the industry? Is it currently supported? Can you get software tools and systems that can open and view that data? Are there other challenges or risks, such as patenting and licensing issues that mean you're locked into a vendor? And all those risks will change over time, so you repeat this kind of assessment process periodically. And a really good example of how to do this sort of risk assessment of file formats is from the National Archives and Records Administration in the US, so that's NARA. They've even provided an SOP for doing this sort of thing. And there's some examples here on this slide for their risk assessments of a range of different types of data, such as databases, spreadsheets, video files, and images. And again, this is all freely available online. Standards, of course, have got a big role to play in digital preservation, not just for file formats such as documents and images and so on, but for metadata and structured data too. This is where the eTMF reference model comes in, especially metadata and the exchange mechanism standard. It's where other CDISC standards help as well. So for example, exchanging and describing study data. And I think it's where some of the new initiatives are going to be really important, such as USDM and DDF and their support for ICH M11. So we're getting closer to the day where pretty much all aspects of a study are now well defined in open standards and formats. And that's really good from a preservation point of view, because open and widely adopted standards, they last longer. They don't become obsolete so quickly. They don't lock you in, and they are more likely to allow you to understand and migrate your data when you need to. So using data standards rather than the digital equivalent of paper, such as PDF, means there's better alignment with the regulations. So ensuring data remains dynamic and data integrity can be more easily verified. So lots of benefits of standards. And now, just the last couple of slides, we can sort of start bringing this together, I think, in a risk-based approach. So you can think about the consequences of not archiving and preserving your TMF records and data properly, and all the bad things that can go wrong are kind of like along the top of this risk matrix. There's the likelihood of problems occurring, such as a loss of data integrity. And over 25 years, there are lots of things that can go wrong. And that's where the Alcoa principles provide a good set of sort of areas for doing risk assessment. So that's kind of down the side of this risk matrix. And then there's the use of digital preservation, good practice, to really drive those risks down to acceptable levels. And if you do that using maturity models, such as DPC-RAM, then you can choose the approaches that are proportionate to the criticality of the data, the systems you're using, and the retention period too. And then finally, that can be incorporated into a risk-based process for selecting suitable systems and solutions. So after you've assessed risks to your critical data and systems and how those risks can be mitigated using digital preservation, I think that puts you in a good place to understand what you really need from an archiving and preservation environment. That then feeds into things like user requirement specification, selecting and qualifying appropriate solutions and vendors, doing validation to check those systems really do provide digital preservation, so they really are fit for purpose for long-term retention of TMF and other data. And in this way, you get a quality risk management approach that goes all the way from the regulatory guidelines through to implementation and use of archiving and preservation solutions, and includes kind of this internationally recognized good practice for digital preservation in the middle, which helps justify, for example, to the regulators that you are actually doing the right thing. I should say at Archivum, we provide a SaaS solution for GXP archiving and digital preservation. And needless to say, it does follow everything that I've talked about, but that's for another day. What I wanted to do really, I think, in this session is kind of raise awareness of digital preservation. It's a thing, and it's got lots of benefits. It really can help with long-term retention of TMF. So please, maybe you want to go and have a look at some of those digital preservation resources that I've signposted and see how you can use them. So I think we're probably done and ready for questions.
Boys, thank you so much. And yes, you were right. It is just right on time. You guys are.
That's a first.
Yeah, exactly. No, I love it. So we got some questions in the chat for you guys. I'll start off with this one because it's a nice little piggyback after what you were just saying. Here, I'm going to pull out. There you go. Yeah. So we got from Katerina. As an Archivum user, our company is interested in the API connections with our eTMF system to archive without extracting each study by hands/loader. Is this something that Archivum plans to do, like more connections to eTMF systems?
Yes, it's a short answer. At the moment, we provide a hosted data archiving and preservation solution. We provide data migration professional services to transfer and migrate studies over, so in mapping and migration. But we're looking about how we can automate that and directly plug into TMF systems. So yes, that's on the way.
Cool. Yeah, I knew it was more of a your solution kind of question, but I wanted to get that while it was hot off of your last sentence. So from Raul, is the publish part support automation predefined AI schedule? Like, oh no, I didn't realize. Sorry, this is it's not really a full question. How much effort?
I think it's in relation to the publish stage of the kind of data timeline. From what I kind of understand of the question, I would say that AI support or using AI on your data probably falls more under the AI piece of it, or not the the use piece of it than the publish piece of it. Publish is really more about what you intend to do with the data as like a final stage of it. So you're going to use AI to manipulate the data or to assess the data, to do whatever it is that you're going to do with the data, but then the results of what you have done with the AI is what you would then publish.
Sure. Cool. And then here we go from Marina. If a company SOP states that a vendor selection files are internal and not in the scope of TMF, in case they are claimed during an inspection, could this constitute as a finding or constitute a finding?
So I think I answered this one during it, but just to, I guess, restate it once again. I find that SOPs that say this is out of scope for an inspector or we will not provide to an inspector only get you so far. It's depending on the organization, depending on the inspector, right? Things can go a lot of different ways. So I'm not going to sit here as like this is the one and true only way to do anything. But if an inspector asks for it and you won't provide it, even if you say it's because it's in our SOP, well, then that could be the finding in of itself, right? They're going to push you on this stuff, even with things with QA, for example, or things like HR records or whatever they may be. There's been plenty of experiences where you say in the SOP that this is out of scope, and then they push on it, and then you end up just giving it anyway. So it's. I mean, if you think that holding back vendor selection documentation is worth it for potentially delaying an approval, then I would reassess the vendor selection process. There really should not be that much information that's part of your vendor selection process or even your vendor qualification process that would be confidential in a way that would be kind of damning to you.
Sure.
That's my 2 cents.
No, I appreciate the reiteration. I know it was like touched on before.
The only thing I was going to say is add to that is have a look in ICH E6 R3. So the bit about essential records, it's pretty broad and does include things like how you've selected vendors and validated systems and all those sorts of things. So
sorry, Marina just responded within the Q&A thing. So it's not that we would refuse to disclose it to an inspector, but there's information that we may not want to disclose to other stakeholders with access to the TMF. Completely agree. Right, even talking about if you're asking questions about cost or you have bid defense information and that you don't want the other vendors to see. Absolutely, that is very common. Ultimately, what that would go down to is where is it being stored then? If it's not being stored in the TMF, although many TMF solutions have an option for this where they can either restrict an artifact or restrict an area so that not all users can see it and just your internal team can see it. But if that's not the way that your system is configured, you can have another location. You could have an internal location. It could be in your QMS system. That you could reference as the authoritative source for that record. Cool. But yes, if there's something that you don't feel should be in the TMF because you're worried about other people seeing it, it just means that there needs to be another home for it.
For sure. So we have a hand raised. I just want to make sure. Chanel, is that on purpose? Because I think if I hit approve, it'll pull you up on stage, and I don't want to surprise you if that's not intentional. Chanel, if you're in the chat, let me know if you want me to approve your. Yeah. If not, then we will continue. We got another question here. So we got, is there a recommendation on when an organization should switch to true digital preservation solution, number of studies, size, etc.?
I think it's all going to depend, isn't it? It's going to depend on, what sort of data there is. So if it's, dynamic data, maybe it stays in a live system for slightly longer. So all that functionality can be maintained, and then you archive and preserve it into a separate system afterwards. Maybe you want to get it out into a preservation environment as soon as possible because there are other considerations around cost, for example, of leaving things in live systems. So there's always a balance between sort of inspection readiness, cost, risk, what type of data it is, and what sort of volumes you're dealing with. So it's really hard to give a rule of thumb on when. Only that you should, I guess, take a risk-based approach and assess wherever your data is for whether it's going to meet the regulatory requirements and data integrity. And there are, as I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of benefits for getting it into a proper archiving and preservation environment.
Yeah,
absolutely. And just to piggyback on that, Matthew, there's a lot of different scenarios, right? I mean, these could be the studies that your company has run, depending on the size of your company. If you have gone through a merger, you've gone through an acquisition, and someone just sent over a bunch of studies that were like, hey, here were some studies that we ran years ago that are related to the product you just purchased. Those might be prime candidates for just going right into an archive and preservation environment because you're not intending on doing anything with it, right? I think it goes right back to what Matthew was saying, is kind of assessing the risk associated with the files and what you're intending to do with them in the short term and in the long term.
For sure. And we had some sessions yesterday about risk-based approaches and the risks of not taking a risk-based approach. So I definitely suggest going back and watching. Yeah, like I thought that was a great title, The Risks of Not Taking a Risk-Based Approach. So definitely go back and watch that, and you'll definitely get some more in-depth answers about from that question, I think, Pallavi. And so here we go. We got a question from Eleanor. From the CEO perspective, is there a standard or recommendation for timing a TMF archival and delivery to a sponsor? Thinking about risk mitigation, I would think that I should wait until the final study documents are complete and filed in the TMF, but oftentimes sponsors are eager to get the archive cost-related and push it separately to receive some of the last documents, such as CSR.
Yeah, this is another risk-based decision, absolutely. Yeah. And when it becomes a business decision, right, cost definitely ends up being one of the main factors that sponsor organizations end up looking at. It also depends on how the conduct of the study has gone, right? I mean, I don't want to get too deep into the rescue studies and all sorts of stuff like that, but if the CRO organization is performing as expected, they're doing well, it's within their environment, 9 times out of 10, my recommendation is to keep it in the CRO environment, right? Sure. It's how your contract was already written. It's how all the plans are described. Those individuals are now using their system and their process. And if midstream you're trying to switch to a new environment with new processes, with new features and functionality, that presents a risk in of itself, right? But if this is, we're talking end of study here, it really ends up, from what I found, being more of a cost decision as to whether you're going to wait for something like the CSR. If you're doing 1 year post FDFs, are you going to wait for those to happen? Those tend to end up being more of a cost-based decision than a conduct and process-based decision.
Sure. No, that makes sense.
I think I'd agree with that. I mean, in our experience, having worked with a range of sponsors and CROs, that it's the obvious point is when the study's kind of closed, all the documents are there and it's complete, and that's the point of transfer, and that's what happens for a lot of our customers. And then, of course, what happens? They go, there's a document missing, or there's something that still needs to be added. So, and then something else comes in. So I think that the most important thing is to have the flexibility to be able to update and add to the archive and have an audit trail of, what happened, not just in the live system, but in the transfer process and then the archive, and to show that if additions or changes do need to be made, then why they've been made and when they were made. So it goes back to this whole sort of timeliness thing, and that extends into the archiving phase as well.
For sure. Well, boys, thank you so much for this presentation. It has been absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure it's very informative for a lot of us. I see the chat has been pretty active, especially for a 9 a.m. on a Saturday, or Friday rather.
Friday, please.
Yeah, not Saturday. My head's already, that's the effect of Friday. It's already, my head's already in the next day. But no, guys, this has been an absolute pleasure. Jim, Matthew, thank you again. That was an absolute pleasure. And
thanks for having us.
Super informative.
Absolutely. Yeah, really great session. Thank you.